Okay, so the siege of Petersburg, and again, when you're thinking about Petersburg, it's the door to Richmond. The other way to think about the siege of Petersburg is that Grant has trapped Lee in these defensive earthworks. He stopped Lee from reinforcing the Confederate army against Sherman. It's a very, very nasty part of the Civil War. There's snipers on both sides. There's a very famous incident called the Crater, and this happened early in the siege, and it was a group of Pennsylvania miners for the Union Army. They felt like they could dig a mine, kind of like what the drug cartels do today, I guess, under Confederate lines, and then they would put dynamite at the end of this mine. So this mine would go under the Confederate lines to the other side of them. Then they would put dynamite at the end of it. Then they would explode this dynamite, which would create a gap in the Confederate lines, which the Union Army could then pour into, and then hopefully destroy Lee's army that way. And everything worked with this plan. The miners knew what they were doing. The Confederates were caught off guard. They didn't really know that there was a mine being built beneath them. But in one of the great tragedies of the Civil War, and it's a war full of tragedies, of course, African American troops had been taught how to take advantage of the gap that had opened up in Confederate lines after the dynamite exploded from underneath them, and how to go in and to fan out and to kind of extend this gap so other Union troops could go in and maybe end the war right then and there. And we're talking about something like July of 1864. But Grant thinks that the mission's too dangerous, and he actually orders the African American troops to stand down. And he has a group of untrained white Union troops trying to exploit the line that's created when the dynamite is exploded. And their commander is I think a guy by the name of Pleasant is actually drunk the night that the explosion goes off. So what happens is everything goes great. These it takes a week, but these miners build a mine underneath Union lines. They put dynamite there. The Confederates don't know what's going on. The Union explodes the dynamite. There's a gap that's created in Union lines. But the Union forces don't exploit this gap. Instead of going in and going to the side, what they do is they go right into the crater and you can still see remnants of the crater today. And so what they do is they trap themselves by going in, and instead of going to either side to try to widen the gap, they do the exact wrong thing. They go into the crater. The Confederate Army is a very professional and a very skilled army at this point. They get their act together pretty quickly after the surprise of the explosion, and they just start picking off Union soldiers and killing a number of them. We think that there were some African Americans who came in later into the battle were executed after the battle was over. There is plenty of very, very convincing evidence that there were murders of African American troops during the Civil War. During the war, after emancipation, 186,000 African American troops served in the Union Army. It was a very significant component of the Union Army. 1 out of 10 soldiers was African American in the Union Army. And we know at Fort Pillow, which is in Louisiana area, there were massacres of captured Union soldiers who were African American, and there's evidence that the same thing happened at the Battle of the Crater, that African American Union soldiers were executed, prisoners of war. So very, very sad. The war could have ended in July of 64 if this thing had gone right, but it went terribly, terribly wrong. So what happens is that Grant settles into this very long siege. It's defensive lines. If you're familiar with World War I, It's basically trench warfare. It's war of attrition, a lot of sniper fire. If you put your head up, you'd get it blown off. Um, just not romantic at all. And this goes on from, mid to late June 64 until April of 65. But ultimately, Grant does manage to wear down Lee's army. And he does this. Lee's army is not that well supplied. Grant is constantly trying to look for gaps in Lee's army. Grant's just not sitting there. He's constantly applying pressure along the defensive position that Lee has created. And so there's an attrition of Lee's troops. The Confederate morale goes down after Lincoln's election, although Southern troops in the Army of Northern Virginia under Lee were pretty fanatically loyal to Lee, most of them anyway, until the very end, the last days of the Civil War, the very end of the Civil War. So Grant is putting pressure on Lee slowly, slowly, slowly. And in early April 1864, Lee decides he has to abandon his defensive position at Petersburg, which he does. And he and the remnants of his army, which is much smaller than it had been, probably less than 20,000 men at this point, they make a run for the west. And then, boom, Grant, after 10 months, has captured Petersburg, which allows Richmond to fall. Now, Grant being Grant, he goes after Lee. I think one of Grant's nightmares is that Lee, with his troops, would disappear into the Western theater of the Confederacy and keep the Civil War going. And so he knows that that even the remnants of Lee's army can still do a lot of damage, and that Lee has a great deal of personal popularity. That if he wants to continue what is basically a guerrilla war, that many white Southerners will rally to him. So in early April, Lee abandons his positions around Petersburg. He takes what's left of his army, goes to the west and western part of Virginia, and Grant goes in hot pursuit against him. And about a week or so later, April 8th, Grant has really got himself into a state. His army is going after Lee's army, but it's unclear what the final outcome is going to be. And in his memoirs, Grant talks about he just had this fantastic migraine headache on April 8th, 1865. He was just so tense and so concerned about being able to at least get Lee's surrender and end this portion of the war, which would pretty much have effectively end the Civil War if Lee surrendered in the United States. And Grant talks about having this massive, massive headache. Well, the next day on April 9th, 1865, Grant gets word from Lee that Lee is ready to meet with him and talk about surrender terms. And Grant, in his memoir, said that his migraine disappeared instantly after he got this message from Lee that finally Lee is now going to surrender. So Grant and Lee, they meet at a little spot called Appomattox Courthouse. And it's a very, very interesting scene. When Lee rides up, he's in his finest Confederate uniform. He's dressed to the hilt in a very kind of dignified Robert E. Lee manner, what we think about when we think about Robert E. Lee. So he goes to the surrender in his best uniform, very, ready to surrender. Now, Grant had been out kind of chasing Lee, and he never really had a chance to go back to his headquarters and change into his best uniform. So when Grant shows up, Grant was a very, very low-key general. He's not a guy that needed a lot of military finery. It was very hard to tell who Grant was if you're just looking at him. It's not like he wasn't dressed to the nines. I mean, you would see the stars on his shoulders, and you could tell that he was a general. And I'm sure he had people around him all the time. But when he shows up to Appomattox Courthouse, he's mud spattered. He's been, riding his horse for the last couple of days, and he's just kind of he presents the exact opposite impression of Robert E. Lee. And one of Grant's great biographers, a guy by the name of William McFeely, uh, in a wonderful biography of Grant, McFeely speculates that this is just how Grant wanted it. That Grant had actually gone out of his way not to be near his headquarters, that he wanted to show the distinction between him and it's kind of it's symbolic of the Union Army. It's symbolic of the North. The North are just kind of common working people instead of slaveholders. And that Grant played it just the way Grant wanted to play it. That he's dressed in his military finery, his best uniform, and then Grant rides up very low key, just the only indication of his rank or a couple of stars. He's mud spattered. And this is McFeely anyway speculates, and I think it's pretty convincing, that this is Grant wanted to have that comparison. He wanted to have that distinction between he and Robert E. Lee. Anyway, so they meet. It's pretty clear that Grant's a little bit nervous. He says to Lee, I remember you from the Mexican War, because Lee had been a superstar in the Mexican War. He'd been a very, very heroic figure. And so Grant acknowledges that, and then Lee looks at Grant and says, "You know what? I don't remember you at all. I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I just can't place you." So, it's kind of an odd little bit of dialogue there. And then, Grant's kind of chattering away, which was very unusual for Grant. He was usually pretty taciturn and didn't talk a lot. And then Lee just says to Grant finally, "Okay, you know what? We're here to surrender," he said in a very nice way. Let's go on. Let's just do it. And so they reach surrender terms. Lee surrenders his army. They're going to lay down their arms. Grant, in a very magnanimous gesture, he allows, at Lee's request, he allows Lee's men to keep their sidearms. Because, of course, they come from a rural society and they're going to need sidearms. He allows Lee's men to keep their horses. And so when Grant meets with Lee, and when he gets Lee's surrender, he doesn't kind of rub it in Lee's face or the face of Lee's men. It's not like there's a huge amount of retribution or humiliation or anything of the sort. Grant is quite gracious in accepting Lee's surrender. Like I say, he lets Lee's soldiers keep their sidearms and also keep the horses that they owned as they made their way back home. So there's another interesting sidelight here. So they go on their way. Lee goes out. He's mobbed by his men. He says, we must surrender." But as soon as they leave, the Union officers that were with Grant, they just start tearing up Appomattox Courthouse because they want a piece of this historic event. And so if you were to walk into Appomattox Courthouse like 2 minutes after Lee and Grant left, you would have seen all these Union officers, breaking chairs and taking pieces of the rug, and just so that they had some memento of this historic event. And there's just something that's always struck me about that as very, very human. And anytime you can kind of take the Civil War down, from the shelf and make it more human, I think that's always a good thing.